Well, hello, party people. I'm just going to apologize already. Welcome to the most exciting presentation video, etc. of your life. Strap in, boys and girls. So what's our learning objective here? Explain the process of state building and expansion among various empires and states in the period from 1450 to 1750. So we've looked at a lot of the how, a lot of the why, a lot of the cause and effect of exploration and expansion. And then we've focused really heavily on one very important effect, the Columbian Exchange, and how it affected these different continents of the world. Now we're going to look at the process of how it was that states built, expanded, maintained their power. One thing we'll circle back to again is the trading posts. By controlling different areas, port cities, coastal areas, choke points, Europeans could do things like having people buy a cartaz, trying to control certain areas of trade. The Dutch monopolizing certain spices by conquering, islands in which was the only place where these spices grew. So Europeans established new trading posts in Africa and Asia, which proved profitable for the rulers and merchants involved in new global trade networks. It seems redundant because it is. We've already talked about trading posts. It was already mentioned earlier. I've shown you the map here, but just obviously, if they mention trading posts twice in the same unit, well, you might be saying like, hey, College Board, it seems like you didn't spend a lot of time on this. That's the cynical thing your teacher is thinking. You guys, you're supposed to be optimistic and bright-eyed about the world. So you're just thinking, College Board really wants me to know about trading posts. And you know what? You're right. But it's not just the Portuguese with trading posts, okay? Here's a map from earlier. And now what's been put on it, our trading posts, right? Here are the Portuguese really getting their trading post on. The Dutch, hey Dutch. The Spanish, what up Philippines? Why? The French, where am I English? The English. Okay, good times. And if you notice, their coastal areas, their strategic choke point areas, the Portuguese really getting the strategic choke point. And then the Dutch are like, hey, that's a nice Strait of Malacca. Be a shame if something happened to it. Oh, and it did. What else? Well, not every Asian state just coalesced to the power of the first Iberians, then the British and French and Dutch. Many of them are going to choose to isolate and restrict Europeans. So some Asian states sought to limit the disruptive economic and cultural effects of European-dominated long-distance trade by adopting restrictive or isolationist trade policies. Probably the most famous and one that I'll lecture on pretty heavily in a later time will be the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa shogunate's just going to be like, we got some Portuguese here. Oh, look, Christianity. All right. Rebellions. We're doing so what? No, nothing. Out. Country closed. We can trade through one area, and the only European that's allowed to trade here are the Dutch. And we're going to restrict them so much that we're going to make them trade not in Nagasaki, but on a little artificial fan-shaped island off the coast of Nagasaki. And if anyone here tries to spread Christianity, they can be jailed or killed. So it's going to get very restrictive. The Ming Dynasty, and this will later continue under the Qing Dynasty, are going to restrict Christians and Europeans, which is kind of one and the same to them, to just certain areas in southern China. So let's learn about them more specifically. Asian states that adopted restrictive and isolation trade policy. Here is Ming China. They restricted Europeans to islands in southern China. There's later going to be a conflict over Confucian rights if Christian missionaries like the Jesuits think like, hey, this whole like ancestor veneration, is that kind of like you're praying to dead ancestors? Well, you're not supposed to do that. There's going to be a controversy that they say that's wrong and maybe that should be discouraged against. The end result later on in the Qing Dynasty, and I know we're not there yet, but the Qing Dynasty does come into power before the end of 1450. They're actually going to end up restricting that. They're going to adopt something called the Canton system, in which there's just certain areas like Macau and Hong Kong, etc., where you're going to have Europeans. Remember this, because this is going to be a point of contention, especially with the British. They try to get rid of this system. The British are later going to get opium. The Chinese want opium. They're going to become a big old international drug dealers. and there's going to be a series of wars called the Opium Wars that will actually break out and will hurt a lot of the autonomy of China, something that still echoes to this day in modern geopolitics. And so this is starting now from the restriction of the Europeans into certain parts of southern China. Europeans will be pushing against this for a long time until finally they're powerful enough to actually do something about it. So remember it. And then I talked about a little bit, but the Tokugawa period, it's a period of restriction. They isolate themselves for over 220 years. They severely restrict trade. The Dutch are the only Europeans allowed to trade. They have to trade on an artificial island near Nagasaki, and they ban Christianity. So that is quite restrictive. Next historical development, driven largely by political, religious, and economic rivalries, European states established new maritime empires, including the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, and British. So this is then going on to some causes. Now, what were the causes for exploration? Well, they're wanting trade. But what about now the causes of them actually creating these empires? And so a lot of it is competition, right? They rival each other. They're these small fractured states of Europe. They have this economic philosophy of mercantilism that says if France gets wealth, that means the English lost that wealth. It's not how modern economics work or how most economists would think. But that's what they thought. They thought you got to get all the gold and silver and like stick it in your ears or something. I don't know. Don't fact check that. Anyway, or just don't fact check anything. Everything I say is perfectly right. I shall not be questioned. So driven largely by political, religious, economic. Now, we've looked at religious too, right? Protestants and Catholics are wanting to spread their faith to different parts of the world. There is kind of this, there's this competition of, are we going to get more Protestant Christians or more Catholic Christians, right? Political rivalries are basically trying to make sure that they have more power than other countries. Economic rivalries, we've kind of gone over that, but mercantilism, trade, etc. And then know that the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, and British are the big European players at this time. But world history tries to not be so Eurocentric. It's pretty difficult in this unit not to talk heavily about Europe because Europe's going to affect so much of the world from this time period. But let's talk about the African kingdoms that actually grew and participated in many of this trade. Many of this trade? You know what? I'm leaving it in. That's right. I'm human, guys. The expansion of maritime trading networks fostered the growth of states in Africa, including the Ashanti and the Kingdom of the Congo, whose participation in trading networks led to an increase in their influence. And a lot of the trade happening here is going to happen within the context of the African slave trade and the triangle trade. So remember, Africans largely will capture other Africans, and then in trading posts or in aboard their ships in coastal areas, Europeans will buy slaves. They will then send them primarily to the Caribbean and Brazil, and then that's just part of the triangle trade. So these are two examples of African states that basically grew because of their participation in trade. And here's Freemanpedia's map of it. It's pretty nice. Let's go on to our next learning objective, y'all. Explain the continuities and changes in economic systems and labor system from 1450. All right, hold on a second. We have got something that is just so important. We have to know it. Are you listening? Okay, continuity and change. College Board loves continuity and change. They love cause and effect. They love compare, contrast. Okay, so let's review. Continuity is something that continues to happen, something that was happening before this period and continues throughout it, or something that was happening at the beginning of this period and continues throughout it. Change is the opposite, something that was happening earlier and now isn't happening, or something that wasn't happening and now is happening. Or it can be even within the time period of 1450 to 1750, something that was happening at the beginning of the period but has changed, or vice versa, okay? So let's look at the specifics College Board wants you to know. Finally, there are changes in economic systems. And so I've split up the historical development here, so the grammar is going to be a little funny. But despite some disruption and restructuring due to the arrival of Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch merchants, so what's the big change? Europeans are now in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese and Spanish and Dutch are setting up trading post empires. The Portuguese will, issue the cartas. The Dutch will start conquering and monopolizing spices. So that's the change. But despite all of that, let's get to our continuity. Existing trade networks in the Indian Ocean continued to flourish and included intra-Asian trade and Asian merchants. So there is a continuity. Before the Europeans showed up, guess what? There was already an Indian Ocean trade network. It had existed for a very long time at this point, predating where we even start. Us starting in 1200, the Indian Ocean network has been there for centuries at this point, right? So that's there. A lot of the merchants, Swahilis, Omanis, Gujaratis, Javanese, and countless others are continuing to trade here. It's predominantly a Muslim-dominated area, right? It's definitely within the maritime world of Dar al-Islam, and that continues. The goods being traded continues to be predominantly Asian goods. Really, the Dutch, they figure this one out a lot. The Dutch show up. The Portuguese try to control it. The Dutch do try to monopolize certain areas, but they realize, like, hey, we can just become one of the, various states trading along the Indian Ocean. And so the Dutch will, although they will export a lot to Europe, they'll make a lot of their money just moving goods around the Indian Ocean. And so that's really just a continuity. It's a change because there's a new group there, right? There's people with lighter skin who are from Western and Northern Europe. They have different technology. They speak different languages. But what are they engaging in? Trade, right? And so that's very much a continuity. The specific merchants that are mentioned, which are already on the map, and I just zoomed in here, ones that could be examples of a continuation of the same groups trading, the intra-Asian groups trading: Swahili Arabs, Omanis, Gujaratis, and Javanese. So let's look at continuity in labor systems here. Newly developed economies in the Americas largely depended on agriculture, utilized existing labor systems, including the Incan Mita. So agriculture, guys, it might seem incredibly obvious if College Board asks you, develop an argument that analyzes the continuity and changes of labor systems in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas from 1450 to 1750. That's really broad. I don't know if you get one that broad and then such a specific thing to talk about in such a broad area. But let's say that you did. It might seem obvious to be like, well, agriculture is still predominantly done. You have various forms. Why am I adopting this voice? I don't know. You have various forms of free and unfree labor. You have serfdoms continuing. Okay, cool. But you could also talk about, hey, there was a labor system in the Americas before the Spanish showed up. The Mita system. I teach it kind of as a labor tax, right? Every so often, the Incan men and women have to do stuff like building infrastructure, building bridges, roads, building textiles, etc. And the Spanish adopt that, and it's a form of coerced labor. It gets a lot more slaverish, and they especially use the Incans because the Inca are in the Andes. They're much more accustomed to higher altitudes and working on mountains, and so they use them to mine silver in the mountain of Potosi. And so, yeah, that's a continuity. You could also argue a little bit it's a change because they changed the system. Speaking of changes in labor systems, colonial economies in the Americas introduced new labor systems, including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and the encomienda and hacienda system. Okay, this is from Freemanpedia. It talks about what these different things do. You can really just group the encomienda and hacienda system together. They're definitely different. But they're really treating natives in a quasi serfdom area. You're working in a farm plantation thing. You have the lords. It started off earlier with conquistadors getting strips of land, and then it gets improved. But you can kind of think of it as a harsher form of European serfdom. Indentured servitude, we should all remember from U.S. history, 8th grade, but that was basically, it costs a lot of money to send someone from one place to the other, so you were basically in debt, working off your debt, and in that time, you were very much like a slave, and then you were free. And then there's the most insidious, the one that everyone knows by now, chattel slavery. And that is where slaves are treated like property, and it comes to be associated with race, specifically West Africans, associated with black skin, and it's going to obviously affect relations in the Americas for centuries to come after that. And so Freemanpedia does a really good job of giving you a rundown of these different systems. And so if you want to pause it and look at that, you can. As always, if you are not using Freemanpedia, good Lord, it is such a great resource, and you just really need to be using it. Just on visuals alone, he does such a great job of taking these ideas and putting them into easy-to-digest little visuals, things you could print out. And the website's very much under construction right now, and if it's anything like it was for the old site, it's this the wealth of resources here. Like you just have to be using it. It really just breaks everything down so well. All right. One of the last learning objectives here, more on continuities and changes. Explain the continuities and changes in systems of slavery in the period from 1450 to 1750. Here are some continuities in systems of slavery, right? And this is very basic here. We're really looking at location in the continuities and the change. Slavery has existed in civilization. Like pretty much once you get civilization, you get slavery. But African slavery wasn't a brand new thing. It continued in its traditional forms, including incorporation of slaves into households and the export of slaves to the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean region. Places like the Ottoman Empire were heavily in the slave trade. A lot of it was East African slaves as well, but you were getting slaves exported to the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. You were getting slaves used in Dar al-Islam. This is in many ways a continuation too of where slaves used to come from the Slavic areas, the kind of what are known as like the Western Steppes, places getting near the Black Sea, in which you had these Slavic peoples that would be captured, especially with the Venetian slave for spice trade, where they would get slaves, sell them to the various Muslim caliphates, especially working with the Ottomans. Before that, you had Mamluks getting these, and these slaves would become soldiers, but you also had, household slaves, plantation, agriculture slaves as well. And that continues. If you look at this map, you can see here where slaves are going in the Indian Ocean. If you could, I have another map. It's a little more difficult to see. But just imagine some of these arrows just going into the Mediterranean, these various islands up here too. And there you have more. There you have more of the Indian Ocean slave network. And then this one in green is showing the Arab and Ottoman slave trade, where you're getting, again, slaves from areas, Central West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and moving up into the Mediterranean region. And that continues to happen. Finally, let's start to look at a change in systems of slavery. And this really goes with the growth of plantation economies in America. So the growth of the plantation economy increased the demand for slaves in the Americas, leading to significant demographic, social, and cultural changes. Okay, so let's look at those. Plantation economy, we should know what that is by now. It's predominantly growing sugar, and it is going to lead to upwards of maybe 15 million slaves from West Africa being taken, transported, shipped to predominantly Brazil and the Caribbean, but then also going to other parts of the Americas. And it is going to have huge demographic changes. The demographic changes won't just be in the Americas. Yes, you will get a much larger African population in the Americas, and Africans being non-native to the Americas, right? But it has huge demographic changes in West Africa. It throws off the gender balance, right? There are substantially more women than men, so women start to get more rights in some ways, serving in positions that they used to not be able to do because that was roles reserved for men, but also losing rights in many ways because they still had to run the household while running other parts of like public life that they hadn't historically done. Also, polygamy rises because now you have fewer men, so a man marrying multiple wives. And I don't care what society you're in, polygamous societies have existed for a very long time, and pretty much any time you look at a society and one man is married to multiple women, you've got a pretty concrete chance that is a patriarchal society, right? So obviously women have lost rights here too. Social and cultural, that kind of goes with it too, but also with slaves moving to the New World, you have cultural changes, you have a blending of religious traditions, language, the rise of syncretic religions, new foods like we discussed, moving to the New World, big time social thing, especially in Latin America. You're going to get the Spanish social order, or the Sociedad de Castas, and you're going to have the various, like, okay, somebody is purely African, they're here in a class system. Someone is half African, half European, they're here. Someone is part native, half African, they're here. Like, and you get that really, really, really specified, drawn out Castas painting we looked at, where you see, like, okay, this person's a quarter this, quarter that, half that. Where does that put him in society, right? It's also going to have these big social implications as well in what will become the United States later on. So plant the flag there. It's obviously going to have a huge impact on things in the United States, like the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement and just race relations in general. And there you have it, folks. Bye.